Welcome to Ask an Attorney, Florida Elder Law and Medicaid Planning.
Hey everyone, welcome into the first episode of Ask an Attorney, Florida Elder Law and Medicaid Planning with John Frazier of Pippin Law Group PLLC. I am your host, Mike Leon. John here is a Florida Elder Law and Medicaid Planning attorney based out in Largo. He's got an advanced degree in business and tax law and experience helping more than 3,500 families secure long-term care coverage. And his practice focuses almost exclusively on protecting assets and helping clients qualify for Medicaid benefits the right way. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about how Medicaid actually pays for assisted living and nursing home care in the state of Florida. John, it's good to see you. I live in Florida as well, a little further south of Largo. So before we get into a little bit more of the Florida stuff, let's talk a little bit about your background. Can you share a little bit about what led you to kind of focus on this area of the law, whether elder law and Medicaid planning specifically?
Thank you for having me, Mike. I think the main reason why I ended up practicing in Medicaid planning and elder law is I was actually originally hired to be the tax attorney back in 2001 by the founder of the law firm. I've got an advanced degree in tax law from the University of Florida. It's called an LL.M in taxation, but it quickly became apparent that our client base had a much greater need for Medicaid planning and elder care as opposed to tax planning. We have more of a middle-class, working-class client base rather than a wealthy client base. So the Medicaid planning and elder law was a much better fit for our law practice and our law firm.
Well, that's great to hear. Now let's get into the area of expertise as to why we're doing this. So when families out there, especially obviously it's very prevalent in the state of Florida, but when families start looking at assisted living or nursing home care here in Florida, what is some of the biggest misunderstandings that they tend to have about whether or not Medicaid will actually pay for it?
Well, I think many clients think, well, they have too many assets for Medicaid. Some people have heard it's a $2,000 asset limit for an unmarried Medicaid applicant. And although that is true, here in Florida, we've got some very extensive asset restructuring strategies that are available under Florida law. So even though there are strict asset limits and there's also an income limit, there are many legal ways that we can capture Medicaid benefits for both nursing and assisted living facility residents. And as a matter of fact, my largest Medicaid case was actually $3.7 million. Although that's not typical, it is possible. We have a strategy here in Florida for married individuals called spousal refusal, where you take the countable assets, you move those countable assets over to the well spouse's name, bring the Medicaid applicant spouse to less than $2,000. And we have that strategy available here in Florida, although that is certainly not my typical client. We do have clients with a lot of money and we can get them on Medicaid.
John, can I ask you about something you just said there about nursing home versus assisted living? Can you kind of explain how does the Medicaid coverage work differently for someone that is in a nursing home versus an assisted living facility?
Yeah, there are a couple of big differences. I think the very first difference that I tell clients about is that there is no waiting list for nursing home Medicaid. Under federal law, when the federal laws were originally passed by Congress, it said there was no waiting list for Medicaid. Well, in the decades since then, as we've seen, we've got a multi-trillion-dollar federal deficit now. And so we have waiting lists now for some of our Medicaid programs in Florida, and they're called Medicaid waiver programs. So that's one of your big differences. For nursing home Medicaid, no waiting list, but you have to financially qualify. However, for assisted living Medicaid, the person must first go through a waiting list process with an organization called the Area Agency on Aging. And there's a form called the 701S screening form. And long story short is, the person must get a score of a 5 on the 701S screening form, and then the waiting list will be no longer than 30 to 60 days for assisted living Medicaid. So that's a very important thing, and I would say really none of my clients have heard anything about that. So that's one huge difference. The other difference is that the reimbursement for assisted living Medicaid is not as generous as for nursing home Medicaid. So let's say that you have an individual, let's say that person is in a nursing facility and unmarried, and they have $1,000 a month in Social Security. Well, that $1,000 a month is going to cover the entire bill at any nursing facility in the state of Florida. And it's called the Medicaid patient responsibility. So you start out with $1,000 a month in the gross income. You subtract $160 a month, which is called the personal needs allowance. So everybody on nursing home Medicaid is allowed to keep $160 a month to get a haircut, buy extra food. They're also allowed to keep, if they have health insurance, secondary health insurance. We have a fair number of clients who are paying, maybe $200-$300 a month for AARP supplemental, Blue Cross Blue Shield supplemental. They also get to keep that. So you get those two deductions. And then so you can see if you're starting out at $1,000 a month and you take those two deductions, you're talking about maybe paying $700 a month for a nursing facility that may charge up to $18,000 a month. So you're talking about saving tens of thousands of dollars per year. So if you take that same person and they're in an assisted living facility, the reimbursement from the state of Florida is different for ALF Medicaid. So the calculation is really different for each and every person. And there's a couple different reasons for that. One reason is that everybody's income is different, so that's a difference. The other reason is the cost of the assisted living is going to be different for every assisted living facility, and many of those assisted living facilities have different levels of care, so the higher the level of care, the higher the cost. And then another issue is that the state of Florida and the Tampa Bay area only pays between $1,200 and $1,800 a month in excess of the person's monthly income. So if you got the individual with $1,000 a month in income, and let's say the state of Florida is paying $1,800 a month on top of that, well, that will cover a facility that's close to $3,000 a month in cost. So it's a different calculation for each assisted living Medicaid recipient. Another factor which impacts that is that everyone on the Medicaid programs that I work in are required to sign up for an insurance company called a managed care organization, or an MCO. And each one of those organizations is going to pay a different amount. They're involved in setting how much the assisted living is going to be paid each month. So that's another consideration. So it's really a case-by-case basis, is the cost based on the person's monthly income, the managed care organization that's selected, and the private pay cost of the assisted living. So there are very significant differences between nursing and assisted living Medicaid.
Yeah. No, it's a great breakdown. I was going to ask you about like what expenses and responsibilities does the resident still have. So I'm glad that you did all that. But let me ask you real quick on the financial requirements front. What are some basic financial requirements in Florida right now in terms of income, what you have assets for someone that is applying for long-term care Medicaid?
Okay, the general rule is that the Florida homestead is going to be exempt for most of my clients. This year, the homestead equity cap is $752,000. So, and that's based on the property tax bill. So if you've got a homestead property with a $500,000 amount on the property tax bill, that's going to be an exempt property for an unmarried Medicaid applicant. If you have a married Medicaid applicant and there's a spouse living in the house, there is no cap. So they could be living in a $2 million house, and that will be exempt. Then one car of any value is exempt. So right there's two significant assets potentially that are going to be exempt under Florida law. And then the next question is the person single or married? For an unmarried Medicaid applicant, there's a $2,000 asset limit. If you have a married couple and both are applying for Medicaid, there's a $3,000 asset limit for both spouses. Let's say they're both in the same room in the same nursing facility. So they're only allowed to have $3,000 total. So they don't double it up. They don't give them $4,000. State of Florida gives them $3,000. And then if you have one spouse in the nursing facility and one spouse in the community not applying for Medicaid, the spouse in the nursing facility is allowed to have $2,000, and the asset limit for the spouse in the community is $162,660. So there are some, pretty tight asset limits. But I had mentioned that strategy called spousal refusal, for example. So there are several different ways. Let's say you've got a married couple with $500,000. So the starting point when we have a case where one spouse is applying for Medicaid, the other spouse in the community, what we typically do is we must get that Medicaid applicant to less than 2,000. The primary way that we do that for a married couple is to do a transfer of the extra assets over $2,000 into the name of the spouse still in the community. So going back to that example, say that we've got the Medicaid applicant with $1,500 in their name, and then the spouse in the community with about $500,000. So most of the time, my clients are going to use the strategy called spousal refusal if we're talking about several $100,000. And that's a strategy that's authorized under federal law. And here in Florida, it's also authorized under state law.
John, let me ask you, like, how does the process typically unfold from that moment when someone realizes that, we may need care to the point where like Medicaid benefits actually start to begin for them?
Well, many of our clients are actually already in a facility when we're first hired. It's very common to see someone who's had a stay in the hospital, a stroke, heart attack, a fall. We see lots and lots of falls. They have a 3-day inpatient stay in the hospital. Then they're discharged to a rehab facility, which is a skilled nursing facility here in Florida. And then most of my clients are going to have Medicare coverage. And so if they have Medicare, if they have a 3-day inpatient stay in the hospital, they're going to be discharged to the rehab under Medicare. And then Medicare will pay for their stay 100%. 1 through 20 days, as long as they're making progress in therapy. So the person has to make progress in therapy during that time. And then 21 through 100 days, there's a deductible. So as long as they're making progress in therapy, they may get up to 100 days of coverage, but most of my clients plateau in therapy before 100 days so that the Medicare coverage stops. And then if the person's long-term, we're then going to need to apply for Medicaid for most of my clients, because the average cost of care is about $10,000 a month. And as I'd mentioned, some of these facilities are charging up to $18,000 a month. So potentially up to $200,000 a year. And even if you've got a couple $1,000,000, if the person's long-term in a nursing facility, it could potentially wipe the family out. So,
man, it's very, very expensive. The numbers start to add up for sure.
Yeah.
John, let me ask you for that family that's maybe listening to this episode right now, and they are facing a care decision right now about somebody. They're a little overwhelmed by everything you've kind of outlined in terms of rules, deadlines. What's something that you would advise them to understand that can maybe make a difference between that smooth approval or maybe even a denial and delay in the process?
Well, we typically have 3 different scenarios. Somebody in a skilled nursing facility, they're going to be long-term. Somebody already in an assisted living facility, again, they're going to be long-term. Or someone still in the community, which has that person's been given a diagnosis, which is something that current medicine can't cure. I would say the most common diagnosis, probably by far, is dementia and Alzheimer's. So I would say 50 to 60% of my clients are already have a diagnosis of dementia and Alzheimer's at the beginning. Typically, oftentimes not too bad, but with time, unfortunately, that will progress. And then so we get some feedback from the doctor typically if somebody's still in the community. So if the doctor is saying that they're going to recommend care within a year, we'll usually start Medicaid planning at that time. And if the person's likely going to an assisted living rather than a nursing facility, then we would go through the waiting list process, the completion of the 701S screening form with the area agency on aging, and then get a score of a 5. And the nice thing about starting early is if the person's in the community, they can become eligible for community-based Medicaid waiver. And the application process is exactly the same for assisted living Medicaid. So that waiting list process, the 701S screening form, everything is exactly the same. You get the score of the 5. Asset limits are exactly the same. Then we get that person on the Medicaid waiver program in the community. And then let's say a year down the road, they're ready for care at that point. At that point, they're already eligible for Medicaid and they can actually go to the assisted living or a nursing facility and they're already approved for Medicaid. So that's a lot of our cases will start that way too, with a diagnosis, which is basically, dementia, Parkinson's, or some other problem that, modern medicine can't cure.
Yeah. Well, John, it's great insights and analysis and breaking this all down for the audience. I appreciate it as always.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me today.
Well, and that's it for today's episode of Ask an Attorney, Florida Elder Law and Medicaid Planning. If you want to learn more about Florida Medicaid planning, assisted living coverage, or even nursing home benefits, do me a favor right now. You can visit one of these two sites, estatelegalplanning.com or attypip.com, to explore free resources and schedule a consultation with John and the team. And do me one more favor before you go. Hit like, hit subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.